Okay, class, these are our pages. What section we're working on? Reforming Society. If you were there, you live in New York State in 1850s, you are the oldest daughter of your family. Since childhood, you have loved mathematics, which puzzles your family. Your sisters are happy to learning to sew and cook and run a household. You want more. You know there is a female seminary nearby where you could study and learn much more, but your parents are undecided. How might you persuade your parents to send you to school? Building background. Along with changes in American culture, changes were also taking place in American society. A religious revival swept the country. Reform-minded men and women tried to improve all aspects of society. From school to taverns, reforms in education opened up new opportunities for young women. The Second Great Awakening. During the 1790s and early 1800s, some Americans took part in a Christian renewal movement called the Second Great Awakening. It swept through towns across upstate New York and through the frontier regions of Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, and South Carolina. By the 1820s and 30s, this new interest in religion had spread to New England and the South. Charles Grandison Finney was one of the most important leaders of the Second Great Awakening. After experiencing a dramatic religious conversion in 1821, Finney left his career as a lawyer and began preaching. He challenged some traditional Protestant beliefs, telling congregations that each individual was responsible for his or her own salvation. He believed that sin was avoidable. Finney held revivals, emotional prayer meetings that lasted for days. Many people converted to Christianity during these revivals. Finney told new converts to prove their faith by doing good deeds. Finney's style of preaching and his ideas angered some traditional ministers like Boston's Lyman Beecher. Beecher wanted to prevent Finney from holding revivals in his city. You mean to carry a streak of fire to Boston. If you attempt it, as the Lord liveth, I will meet you and fight every inch of the way. Despite the opposition of Beecher and other traditional ministers, Finney's appeal remained powerful. Also, the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of religion prevented the government from passing laws banning the new religious practices. Ministers were therefore free to spread their message of faith and salvation to whoever wished to listen. Due to the efforts of Finney and his followers, church members across the country grew a great deal during the Second Great Awakening. Many new church members were women and African Americans. African Methodist Episcopal Church spread across the mid-Atlantic states. Although the movement began in the Northeast and on the frontier, the Second Great Awakening renewed some people's religious faith throughout America. Page 449, still top. Social reformers speak out. Renewed religious faith has often led to involvement in movements and fix the problems created by urban growth. One solution was political action. For example, in 1844, New York City created the first police force. Members of the growing middle class, especially women, often led the efforts. Many of the women did not work outside the home and hired servants to care for their household. This gave them time to work in reform groups. Temperance movement. Temperance movement came about in the 1800s because of the abuse of alcohol by many people in America. So temperance was an anti-alcohol movement. Many social reformers worked to prevent alcohol abuse. They believed Americans drank too much. In the 1830s, on average, an American consumed 7 gallons of alcohol per year. Countless Americans thought alcohol abuse caused social problems such as family violence, poverty, and criminal behavior. Americans worried about the effects of alcohol that led to the growth of a temperance movement. This reform effort urged people to use self-discipline and stop drinking hard liquor. Reformers asked people to limit themselves to beer and wine in small amounts. Groups like the American Temperance Society and the American Temperance Union helped to spread the message. Minister Lyman Beecher spoke widely about the evils of alcohol. He claimed that the people who drank alcohol were neglecting the education of their families and corrupting their morals. Prison reform. Another target of reform was the prison system. Dorothea Dix was a middle-class reformer who visited prisons throughout Massachusetts beginning in 1841. Dix reported that mentally ill people frequently were jailed with criminals. They were sometimes left in dark cells without clothes and heat and were chained to the walls and beaten. Dix spoke of what she saw to the state legislature. In response, the Massachusetts government built facilities for the mentally ill. Dix's work had a nationwide effort. Eventually, more than 100 state hospitals were built to give mentally ill people professional care. Prisons also held runaway children and orphans. Some had survived only by begging or stealing, and they got the same punishment as adult criminals. Boston Mayor Josiah Quincy asked that young offenders receive different punishments than adults. In 1820, several state and local governments founded reform schools for children who had been housed in prisons. Their children lived under strict rules and learned useful skills. Some reformers also tried to end the overcrowding and cruel conditions in prisons. Their efforts led to the creation of houses of correction. These institutions did not punish alone to change behavior, they also offered prisoners education. Improvements in education. Another challenge facing America in the 1800s was poor public education during this era. Childhood was beginning to be viewed as a separate stage of life in which education was the utmost importance in creating responsible citizens. Does that sound like a familiar theme that we try to talk about at school? However, many children worked in factories or on farms to help support their families. If children could read the Bible, write, and do simple math, that was often considered to be enough. Education in the early 1800s, the availability varied widely. New England had the most schools, while the South and the West had the fewest. Few teachers were trained, schoolhouses were small, and students of all ages and levels worked in one room. McGuffey's readers were the most popular textbooks. William Holmes McGuffey, an educator and minister, put selections from British and American literature in them, as well as instructions in moral and social values. Social background and wealth affected the quality of education. Rich families sent children to private schools and hired tutors. However, poor children had only public schools. Girls could go to school, but parents usually thought that girls needed a little education to keep them home. Therefore, few girls learned to read. Common school movement. People in the common school movement wanted all children taught in common places, regardless of background. Horace Mann was the leader of this movement. In 1837, Mann became Massachusetts' first Secretary of Education. He convinced the state to double its school budget and raise teachers' salaries. He lengthened the school year and began the first school for teachers training. Mann's success set a standard for education reform throughout the country. Women's education. Education reform created opportunities for women. Catherine Beecher started an all-female academy in Hartford, Connecticut, the first college-level educational institute available to women. Was the Troy Female Seminary, opened by Emma Willard in 1821. Several other women's colleges opened during the 1830s, including Mount Holyoke College, the first medical school for women who were barred from men's medical schools, opened in Boston in 1848. Teaching people with special needs. Efforts to improve education also help people with special needs. In 1831, Samuel Gridley Howe opened a Perkins School for the blind in Massachusetts. Howe traveled widely, talking about teaching people with visual impairment. Thomas Galladay improved the education lives of people with hearing impairments. He founded the first free American school for hearing impaired in 1817. Page 452. African American communities. Free African Americans usually lived in segregated or separate communities in the North. Most of them lived in such cities as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Community leaders were often influenced by the Second Great Awakening and its spirit of reform. Founded by former slave Richard Allen, the Free American Religious Society became a model for other groups that pressed for racial equality and the education of blacks. In 1816, Allen became the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME Church. This church broke away from the white Methodist churches after African Americans were treated poorly in some white congregations. Other influential African Americans of the time were such as Alexander Crummell, pushed for the creation of schools for black Americans. The New York African Free School in New York City educated hundreds of children, many of whom became brilliant scholars and important African American leaders. Philadelphia also had a long history of educating African Americans. This was because Philadelphia was a center of Quaker influence, and the Quakers believed strongly in equality. The city ran 7 schools for African American students by the year 1800. In 1820, Boston followed Philadelphia's lead and opened a separate elementary school for African American children. The city began allowing them to attend school with whites in 1855. African Americans rarely attended college because few colleges would accept them. In 1835, Oberlin College became the first to do so. Harvard University soon admitted African Americans too. Several African American colleges were founded in the beginning of 1840. In 1842, the Institute for Colored Youth opened in Philadelphia. Avery College, also in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was founded in 1849. While African Americans had some opportunities to attend school in the North and Midwest, few had the chance in the South. Laws in the South barred most enslaved people from getting an education, even at a primary school level. While some slaves learned to read on their own, they almost always did so in secret. Slaveholders were fearful that education and knowledge in general might encourage a spirit of revolt among enslaved African Americans. Summary and preview. The efforts of reformers led to improvements in many aspects of American life. The early to mid-1800s, in the next section, you'll learn about reform-minded people who opposed the practice of slavery. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.